Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask BirdGuy. I'm Matthew Daughter, Executive Director of Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today we're going to talk a little bit about summer birding, what it is, what it isn't, who's here and who's not. But first I want to mention a couple things about who's not here right now. So you know how fond I am of gulls. Summertime is not particularly a good time to study gulls, because we have far fewer species this time of year in Santa Clara County. Some of them are breeding along the coast, and some are breeding far to the north. Right around here, we have really just California gull and some ring-billed gulls, an occasional glaucous wing or western, but not much beyond that. Later in the fall, we'll start to get lots of gulls, but right now, not a big deal. Not very many to choose from. So if you're afraid of gulls, go birding right now, because there are not really that many out there. California gulls, of course, breed here in huge numbers, but that's just one species. Shorebirds. There are shorebirds here, of course. There are some that breed here, spotted, American black-necked stilts, American avocet, etc. So you can find them here, but not a huge variety beyond that. There are some overwintering birds, but the bulk of our shorebirds will swing through beginning in August. They'll be returning from the breeding grounds far to the north. So you can look for interesting vagrant shorebirds then. Following that, there'll be a lot of birds that will winter here. But for right now, shorebirds again, not that abundant right now. Very small variety. Oddly enough, summertime is actually maybe not the best time to study song. The best time to study bird songs and to listen for them is spring. That's when the birds are setting up their territories, when the males are broadcasting their presence and their willingness to mate. Of course, some females sing as well. We can't forget that. But in summertime, after the nesting has started and many of the young have fledged, there's much less of the characteristic songs. And as we get into fall, that song kind of disappears altogether, with the exception of a few birds like Zonotrichia sparrows. They sing year-round. So in a previous video, I talked a little bit about nest types. And I would like to do that again, but I think it needs a separate video. And in fact, the building of nests right now is not a huge thing, because the nests are either currently occupied already, or they have recently been abandoned because the young have fledged. So this time of year is actually the best time to talk about nestlings. And if you have been birding for a while, you know that every spring you start to see some birds you don't recognize. They look sort of familiar, but not quite. There's always that confusing young song sparrow that makes you think that the Lincoln's has arrived earlier than usual. So what I want to talk about today is how to recognize a young bird and what clues to look for at their true identity. So talk a little bit about that. As well, I just want to mention, when you look at the checklist of Santa Clara County, you see several kinds of situations happening in these status bars. You see ones that have got a gap right in the middle of the breeding season. That should tell you that those birds really aren't breeding here. They pass through, or they winter here, and then they breed elsewhere, probably to the north. So that bird right there, I'm guessing, well, least sandpiper. There you go. So a lot of the sandpipers are missing from our wetland areas right now. By the same token, if you look at this page and you see a bird that has a heavy line in the center of the calendar, again, remember this is the spring and summer period, that bird is present here and really very much less likely to be seen in the wintertime. That is an ash-throated flycatcher and a western kingbird, very similar. They arrive here to breed. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is the the breeding birds and how to recognize their young. I just wanted to point out that just this week, the summer issue of the Avocet arrived in my mailbox. And I know this woman. That's Cricket. Anyway, I've written a couple pieces for this issue. One is about Audubon's COVID response and how we dealt with the Birdathon, a huge social event. How did we deal with that in the middle of a pandemic, and how did we make it a successful venture? Also, there's the usual column, What to Look For, and that talks a lot about what I want to discuss today, summertime birding. There are a few things to understand about nestlings and fledglings before we get much farther. One is the difference between altricial and precocial young. So this first image shows an altricial young, which is hatched featherless and blind, eyes closed, helpless. So this bird requires a lot of parental care. On the other side of that is the precocial young, like this bird. This bird is born with its eyes open and it's ready to go to start feeding itself. It'll follow its parents and find its own food with some help from the adults. These two terms, altricial and precocial, represent extremes in the spectrum of parental care. There are lots of birds that fall somewhere in between precocial and altricial in the state of their young. Now, for more information about those terms and what they mean and their potential evolutionary origins, you could look at the Birdwatcher's Companion, one of my favorite books. It has a really nice article on the development of young. Pretty much any dictionary on avian terms like this one will give you a quick understanding of terms like precocial and altricial. Frank Gill's Ornithology, this is a somewhat older edition, but it has much the same information. Keep going here. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology Handbook of Bird Biology, of course, an exceptional book. This one has been replaced by a newer version. It is extremely good. It has a lengthy discussion about patricial and altricial. And then, of course, the Handbook of Bird Biology by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. This basically took the place of the previous book. So wonderful, wonderful books that will enrich your understanding of those terms and the possible origins of those adaptations. Now, the other thing is, when we're looking at the following examples of young birds, I'd like you to think a little bit about whether it looks like a precocial young or an altricial young, and I would like you to look for trends, things that we can say just across the board about these young birds, these fledglings or juveniles. That's another thing we should mention. What is a fledgling? What is a juvenile? Fledgling, of course, is recently left the nest, and it may be quite different from what we often call juvenile. They're going to be similar, but most field guides show you juveniles. Like here, this American robin. You see these spots here on the juvenile bird. The fledgling is going to look very, very similar to that. As we get to a somewhat older bird, an immature, those spots might go away, and it will, to me at least, here's the sequence: fledgling, juvenile, immature. Now, that may not actually be correct. That's just the way I break it down. The fledgling is the youngest, the one that's just left the nest. The juvenile is independent, completely independent, feeding itself, but lacks adult plumage. And then we've got the immature, which, pretty much the next stage in development. So pretty much all field guides make some effort to show you the most common of the juvenile or the fledglings. Here in this case is the dark-eyed junco, the one that we see right now, the young ones with stripes and spots, very different from their parents. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. these birds have a very, very different plumage. That robin I showed you with the spots, the dark-eyed junco in here with the spots and streaks, western bluebirds with spots. All these birds look very different from the adults. Sometimes they're easy to recognize and sometimes they're not. So let's take a look at a few examples and talk about each one as we go through it. So there's 6 things I want to talk about as far as recognizing fledgling. The first of which is what we call a fleshy gape. So if you look at this portion of the bird's mouth, that corner of the mouth, the base of the bill between the upper and lower mandible, is called the gape. And if you look at some of these images, you'll see that all these young birds, all these fledglings, share kind of a fleshy pinkish or yellowish gape. The first one is, you probably recognize it from the field guide image I showed a while ago, is the American robin. Now there are some other features that this picture illustrates, but we're just going to focus on that fleshy gape right in the corner of the mouth. And likewise, these barn swallows here, the ones on the nest, those 3 birds on the nest, see that big swollen fleshy area at the corner of the mouth? And the fleshy gape actually is an adaptation. It helps the adult direct the food into the mouth. Sometimes you'll see markings inside of the mouth as well, but that fleshy gape actually is really visible in a darkened nest. And it does help the adult find the young's mouth and place the food inside the mouth. So that's why you see it on the American robin, the barn swallow, and this house sparrow. And as well, the northern mockingbird. Now there's something that makes all these birds an interesting group. And if you've figured out that they're passerines, that's correct. Most of the altricial young that we find are passerines. These birds are all altricial. They all reside in the nest. They're born helpless, and they require a lot of parental care, and they need constant feeding. So these birds now, looks like 3 of them have left the nest already. It looks like the American robin might have left the nest, the house sparrow, and the mockingbird are all outside of the nest. So these are fledglings. The barn swallows represent nestlings. So another thing that characterizes young birds, juvenile birds, fledgling birds, is there's a fuzzy or a patterned plumage to many of these birds. Looking right now at the American avocet, this fuzzy, adorable, long-legged thing, doesn't look anything like the adult, really, except perhaps with the bill, which is starting to take on that curvature. The American coot, kind of ridiculous colored clown-like little fuzzy thing, and these common mergansers, European starling, western grebe, and ring-necked pheasants. So these all have a really fuzzy or patterned plumage. And in the case of the ring-necked pheasants, you have to think maybe that's partially a cryptic defense to keep them obscured in the grass and underbrush. I love how the western grebe chick is on the adult's back. I've seen that a few times. Maybe you have too. But what's interesting is how little any of these plumages resemble the adult. So they are fuzzy and protective, perhaps extra downy for cushioning. And in case of the pheasant or some ducks, I think possibly a cryptic plumage to help keep them hidden. The third thing to look for with young birds is what I call shorter, long feathers. Just means that the feathers you expect to be long, such as tail feathers, are much shorter than they are on adults. In fact, sometimes it could look like the tail is completely missing on a fledgling. So take a look at this American crow, for example. You might notice also it has got a blue eye, which is interesting. Corvids, crows, have blue eyes as young birds. But where is the tail? It's completely missing. So not only does this show the fuzziness that you expect with a young bird, but it also has these shorter than usual long feathers. The black-capped chickadee as well. Look how the tail seems to be completely missing and how the wing feathers are very, very short. This bird is not capable of flight yet, of course. And also notice the fleshy gape that we talked about earlier. The northern mockingbird, if nothing else, the long tail of a mockingbird is a good field mark, but in this case we just don't see it. It seems to be stumpy. It hasn't grown out all the way. And finally, this western meadowlark. The plumage is there, and there's another feature we'll talk about shortly, but again, look at that tail. It's completely missing. And my guess is that those wings are probably shorter than they should be on the adults as well. So another hallmark of a fledgling might be the dull or muted color pattern that they show. So they look very much like adults, but their pattern is sort of blurry, unfinished. It's not sharp. So, for example, take a look at this American kestrel. You can see all the features of a male American kestrel, and yet the pale blue is not very saturated. The buff on the breast is not saturated. The pattern on the face is blurry and diffuse. And again, at this killdeer, you can see all the features that will become sharply contrasting adult pattern. But on this individual, it's quite young, and I point out the short tail that we talked about already. There's the song sparrow here, looking very muddy and blurry indeed. You can see the streaks on the breast, but it only hints at the adult plumage at this point. And the spotted towhee, again, shorter than usual tail, and the features rather blurry. More spots than there will show on the adult. And finally, this tree swallow being fed by an adult. You can see two things happening here. One is the lack of iridescence on the young bird, but also the sort of blurriness between the dark upper parts and the pale underparts. So that line, which is usually quite crisp on the adult, is blurry and diffuse. It lacks the sharp color as well. One thing I forgot to point out in the last section was shorter bill. None of these birds actually are showing that here. In fact, we see that mostly with shorebirds. I'm thinking particularly of the avocets, the stilts, and the yellowlegs. As those birds grow, the bills grow as well, and they become the full adult length. So you may see young shorebirds that look rather short-billed. This becomes a problem in fall when we see many immature greater yellowlegs, and suddenly it becomes confusing. Could we possibly be looking at lesser yellowlegs? So that's probably a subject for a different video. But for now, let's move on to the next topic. One last feature of a fledgling bird would be, and this can be said about most animals, including humans, the young often show bad posture. So looking at these birds, the brown-headed cowbird, and we could talk about cowbirds for quite some time and their parasitic nesting strategy, but we'll leave that for another video. But you see here this young brown-headed cowbird just kind of hulking over, and again when it's being fed by the adult. This is, my guess is possibly sort of a feeding, a begging behavior. They're waiting to be fed. They're hunching down like that, protecting themselves, and the adults respond to that. So they come and they feed the cowbird. And again, here the cedar waxwing. A lot of fledglings will sit on branches peacefully, waiting to be visited by adults, waiting to find out what's happening next. And in this case, you can see the bad posture of the cedar waxwing pretty clearly. And also in the northern mockingbird here. These are very, very young birds. They're still being fed by adults. They're out of the nest perhaps, but they're still being fed by the adults. And I just see this bad posture all the time. And it could be that they just haven't developed all the musculature to stand or sit or fly like the adults. So they hold themselves differently. So that's the last feature that I use to recognize fledglings. And I'm just going to go over them in a second now so you can see what we've learned in the past few minutes. So this time of year, summertime, you need to ask yourself, when you see a bird you don't recognize, is it possible that it might be a nestling? And there's an easy way, there are several ways to recognize nestlings, and that would be these. Look for the following features. Do you see a fleshy gape at the corner of the mouth? Do you see fuzzy or otherwise patterned, possibly cryptic plumage that might protect the nestlings or the fledglings? Do you see areas where we typically see longer feathers, like wings and tail? Do you see short feathers in that area? Does the bill look like it's the full size and length of an adult's bill? And the pattern of colors, is it muted? Is it blurry? Is it soft? Does it suggest the pattern of an adult bird, but not quite? And finally, does it have good posture or bad posture? The bad postured individuals might possibly be very young birds that are waiting to be fed again, and they're hunched down, waiting for the adults to bring them food. So those are the 6 ways that I tend to recognize nestlings or fledglings. Maybe that'll help you too. A couple more quick things before I sign off. If you want to see some adorable pictures of young owls, which are often called branchlings because they tend to perch on branches away from the nest, I would take a look at this wonderful book. And here you see that the young owls are pretty adorable, and they're all pretty distinctive, so they're identifiable even without their adult plumage. And finally, one of my favorite books is this, Downy Waterfowl of North America. Who knew there would be a book entirely devoted to this? But inside these glorious plates showing very, very young precocial offspring of ducks, North American ducks. They're all identified, and so those were, well, it doesn't matter at the moment. These wonderful plates, all of these young fledglings are completely identifiable, and any young bird that you find is identifiable too. So good luck, have fun, and we'll see you next time for birding locations to go to during summer.